Hello, I'm Deb Holt Noel. Welcome to this special edition of Mental Health and Suicide Prevention with the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. September is Suicide Prevention Month, and today we're talking to mothers who've lost a child to suicide. Our moderator is Dr. Michelle Laws, the Assistant Director for Consumer Policy and Community Stakeholder Engagement with the Division of Mental Health, Developmental Disabilities, and Substance Abuse Services with the State Department of Health and Human Services. Joining her is Betsy Rhodes, the North Carolina Associate Area Director for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and Tammy Charles, an advocate and mother whose child took his life after repeated bullying at school. We will also hear from a mother who will share her story about her daughter's battle with mental illness, which ended in suicide. And we'll take some of your questions too. Dr. Laws, thank you for bringing this discussion to us today.
Deborah, thank you so much. First, I just want to thank you for being our host today. Many people in North Carolina who are watching, I'm sure, like me, are huge fans of the work that you do here at UNC TV. And so I just want to say thank you, and we're really honored that you're our host. And I also want to thank UNC TV for running or airing and producing this series. It started back in June, and our new director, who's not so new anymore, but the director of the Division of Mental Health, Developmental Disabilities, and Substance Abuse Services, Victor Armstrong, came in with an agenda that included making sure that we increase awareness about suicide and also provide supports to families and persons who have attempted suicide and who've survived, and also just people who are struggling with some of the precursors, depression and anxiety, trauma, and other experiences that make them susceptible or at risk for suicide. So this has been just really a very powerful series, I think, that we've had, and it's been in large part due to the support of UNC TV. So I want to say thank you. I also want to say that, we're often asked, why do we focus attention at this particular time on suicide when there's so many other issues? We're right in the middle of responding to the COVID pandemic and its grips that it's had in North Carolina. And those of us who work for the division, we know very well that this is exactly the time for us to really talk about and to highlight and elevate into the public discourse a discussion about suicide. I just want to give the audience a few statistics. Suicide is the 10th leading cause of death for all ages in the United States, and that's based on data from the CDC reporting on 2018 data. But it's also the 4th leading cause of death for our young people ages 10 to 24. And we know that within the population of those who have attempted suicide or who have thought of suicide, data also suggests from the National Youth Risk Behavior Survey that when we disaggregate that data by sexual identity and gender, those students between the ages of 10 and 24 who identify as LGBTQ plus communities, they're 47% of those students that participated in the Youth Risk Behavior Survey stated that they had thought of suicide within the past 10 months, or that they had suicide ideations. We also know that there are differences in terms of where people live, or differences in geography. So we know that in rural areas, for example, suicide is higher, but when you look at and disaggregate by race and ethnicity and gender, we know that in urban areas for males were 3 to 5 to 3 to 9 times more likely to attempt suicide. And so the rates was 3.5 to 3.9 times more higher than females. And so this is an extremely important discussion. And beyond the empirical data, beyond the statistics and the research, we also know that anecdotally it's important and it's timely. And like I said, we're in the middle of responding to the COVID pandemic. And there are people who are experiencing all different types of psychological distress and mental health conditions. And so we are making sure that the division is poised and leading the way to respond in an effective way to the mental health crisis that we believe is kind of brewing underneath this COVID pandemic. We also know that there are many families who are struggling with ways to express the pain that suicide has caused and to share their stories. I lost my sister to a murder-suicide when I was an undergraduate student at UNC. And my dad and my other siblings, we just didn't talk about it. But I often wondered what she was killed by an ex-boyfriend and the father of her child, their new baby. And so my nephew had to grow up without his mom and his dad. But I often thought about what his mom felt. And I remember distinctly the day that we had her funeral, and there were requests from his mom because she loved my sister too, but she was not allowed to attend the service. And so I started thinking, even back then, the loss that people in these types of tragic experiences, in murder, suicides, and so forth, that both families on both sides need support to help grieve through that whole traumatic experience. And then fast forward it later as an adult, several years ago, also lost another family member who left behind 4 boys. And in our family, we just don't talk about it. We think of him in very fond ways, but we really don't talk about it. And so we wanted to provide space for family members, and in particular, this show to allow mothers who've experienced it to share their stories with the intention of offering hope and with the intention of offering resources and help to other family members who've experienced similar situations and experiences. So I want to get started with our panel discussion. And we'll start today with the conversation with Betsy Rhodes, and she's already been introduced as the area director of the North Carolina chapter of the American Foundation for Suicide. Betsy, I want to thank you so much for being a part of this discussion and bringing awareness to families across our state and hopefully beyond to this very important and timely discussion. First, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Thank you, Michelle. We're pushing through.
Great. That's good to hear. As a mother of a child who died by suicide, share with us more about your son. Who was Luke? Tell us who Luke was, and then also share with us the circumstances and factors that led to his death and how you coped and responded as a mother.
Well, first, Michelle, I want to say I am so sorry for your loss of your sister and your other relative. It is losing a loved one to suicide is a complicated grief, and it's not like other griefs. And so my heart goes out to you.
As well.
Luke this is my Luke. Hopefully you can see that beautiful boy there. Luke was 23. And when you mentioned UNC Chapel Hill, he was an undergrad student. A grad student at UNC Chapel Hill. He had been accepted into the grad program following his graduation from James Madison University. in 2003, in May of 2003. We moved him down to Chapel Hill, and he seemed to be doing well. He seemed to be very excited and about his classes and his new international studies. His goal was to, get proficient at Spanish and teach children in Latin America. And he, on August 3rd, 2003, two policemen came to our door where we were living in Virginia and told us that Luke had died by suicide. And what led to it? Well, there's never one cause. We know the AFSP, being the largest researcher about suicide, and we are evidence-based, we know there's not one single cause to suicide. It's multiple risk factors coinciding with life experiences that result in a mental health crisis that isn't stopped or intervened. There's not an intervention. In Luke's case, I blame ignorance and stigma around suicide. We were very ignorant about mental health, and we did not see his risk factors. After his death, as many parents, and actually as the founders of AFSP 30 years ago, they were lost survivors. I went looking for answers. What just happened? And fortunately, because AFSP has been around for 30 years and doing the research, there was a lot of research to help me figure out the answers. We become a detective in our children's lives. And so what I have since discovered is that Luke had as many as 9 risk factors for suicide. That's not something when you go to your pediatrician, you talk about risk factors for meningitis or risk factors for diabetes or risk factors for maybe juvenile cancer or things like that. We don't talk about risk factors for suicide, and we should be. Every parent should know what those risk factors are and be able to know that maybe their child might be at risk for suicide. And that's something we teach. We do education training. And so people often, when there's a high-profile suicide, people will say, what are the warning signs? What are the warning signs? And I say, if you don't know who's at risk in your life, you probably will not see those warning signs because you're perceiving those warning signs through a lens of life. They're sending out the signals from a lens of death. And so they're letting go of life, and you're seeing them. When Luke gave away some of his belongings, I didn't see them as a risk factor. And that's a classic risk factor. Warning sign. That's a classic warning. I saw it as, oh, isn't that sweet? He's given his brother and sister things as he's loved as a child. Isn't that sweet? So again, had I known Luke was at risk, I would have maybe seen those warning signs more clearly to intervene and get him the treatment he needed. I will say just very briefly, there is hope in this because from what we learned with AFSP, our youngest son, who was 6 at the time of his brother's death, when 10 years later, after Luke's death, he presented with depression, we knew what it was. We had already been watching because we knew that there were some genetic things going on with our family, anxiety and depression. We knew what to watch for. We were able to get him the help, and we had also given him the tools to ask for help himself. And when that young man was 16 years old and had his first and only panic attack, he was able to walk himself. And the first thing that came into his mind, his broken brain in that crisis moment, was, you need to die. He walked into his guidance counselor's office, laid his keys on the table, and said, Mr. Dietz, I'm not safe to drive. Sit with me. Keep me safe. Call my mother. Call my therapist. I need to see my therapist now. That's the power of prevention.
That's right. That's right. Thank you so much. And we'll go back later to listing some of the warning signs so that we can empower people with knowledge about what to do. But I want to now go to our next guest, and we certainly, Betsy, are just thrilled that you are here and that you're sharing, you're courageous enough, and that you refuse to just sit down and, die with your son in both a physical sense as well as a spiritual and emotional sense, but you took action, and it's made all the difference for many people, I'm sure. And so we're glad that you're with us, and I too want to say how sorry I am for your loss as well. Our next guest is another mom, and she is here to share her story. She's actually joining us from Kentucky, and she is here to share her story, her remarkable story of resilience and hope in the face of unthinkable loss. Tammy Charles lost her 10-year-old son back in 2019, and she shared with us that this is the date on the 19th of January, 2019, that her son died by suicide. And he was 10 years old. And I must say that it took me a while to really hunt her down and get at her information. But when we connected, it was such a blessing. It was as if we had known each other for years. And I was just about to give up because I didn't have any way to reach her, and decided to go through Facebook. And so we connected, and I am so glad, Tammy, that you responded. But I want to invite you to the show and want to ask you to just, one, how are you doing and feeling? And then share with us your story, and tell us about Seven and his brief journey and kind of what led to death by suicide, and then how it impacted your life and you responded.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me on the show. I am also a big fan of UNCTV. I can't believe our moderator here. I don't even know how to act. I'm such a fan for her. And we, my husband, just like Betsy said, we are doing surprisingly well. Um, I say surprisingly because you did say that we did not decide to lay down and die with our children. Although that is an overwhelming feeling and it never goes away, only you are equipped enough to do the battle on the other side, for other people and other parents. And that in itself has given us new life, to continue. Seven was 10 years old, and he was born in 2008, and I was 35 years old. Now, I will tell you this, I was told that I was not even able to have children. I was 35, my husband was 52, and I honestly really didn't think that gun shot anymore. For 10 years, for 10 years, we had a gift, an amazing gift, a miracle gift. Our son, and his name was Seven Bridges. Already a unique name, already a unique child who was born with a birth defect of imperfect anus. And fast forward to his 10th year, we really dealt a lot with surgeries and fecal incontinence and, things that we would have to do just to make our life what we call normal. At 10 years old, none of that had anything to do with his death. He got bullied on the bus. He got choked on the bus. And as a parent, I went to the school and we pretty much advocated for where the people tried to sweep it under the rug. So I came to them and said, I don't want to know what about the perpetrator. How do I help the victim, my son, who came to my bedside for a couple nights after that and said, Mommy, I thought he was my friend. From that, as I advocated for him, my son began to bear the brunt of it. The adults began to shun him. Locally, I went to every single major place that I could, the school board, the urban league, my churches, 100 Black men, everybody. How can I help about bullying and getting the information about it? And it was an uphill battle. And I was really taken aback because I am a very active parent. I told you it's my only child. We had lunch once a week for 9 years at his school. I did everything at the school. So I really didn't think that the school would not report, not do anything about our son being choked on the bus. Seven was an incredibly compassionate child. Even when he got choked, he told his dad, Daddy, my friend on the bus choked me, but please don't be mad. I think he has a mental problem.
Mm.
While he was on the bus and they saw the video, his principal told me that when he got choked, he did not fight back. He was able to wiggle out of the choke and sat down and immediately put his hands together to pray for the boy that choked. Immediately. The little boy began to cry for some of the other students that made some remarks to him. And Seven immediately just reached right over to him and said, "Are you okay?" That was the compassionate child that we raised. After we went through all of the advocacy and that about the bullying and just about how you guys try to sweep it under the rug, like it wasn't a problem for either child. I did not want my child to become just an unnamed victim in this bully's wake. And maybe he needed some things as well. From that, the teachers began to shun him because, of course, they were investigated because, like I said, I went to everyone. And they began to shun him and they began to talk to him roughly and not cater to his needs. Back to the perfect anus. He would have to, of course, make several bathroom calls. His teachers began not to allow him to do that. So then my son would, of course, begin to have the fecal incontinence and he would smell a little and the class would begin to make fun of him and he would go to the teacher, of course, the person that we empower to be the parent when we are away from our child. And she, of course, harbored these same ill will feelings about us advocating for our child. And it really shocked us because we were like, you should be echoing us and not using our child as some sort of marker to pay something back on him. He was the one choked. I never stopped him from going to school. Well, 5 months later, almost to the day, they were out of school for Christmas break. And then he went to school for 3 days this week. And he told me, prior to that, we were talking to the teachers and, back and forth with the principal, because once I took it to the news, they realized that I was one of those parents that going to have to do a little bit more because we do a lot. Mm-hmm. My son was supposed to go to a birthday party that day. It was Martin Luther King weekend. And because of my son's condition, mostly all the kids just came to our house. We were the house that everybody came to. So in that, I got up that morning and I did laundry and I had Seven. We rarely left him at home. And my husband's car was down and I had to drive him to choir practice. And then I went to the Kroger, the grocery store, to get him snacks for all his little friends that would be coming home. I was gone an hour, 40 minutes. And I came to my home to, of course, knock on the door to get your son. You know how you get your kids, come get these groceries out of the car. I knocked on that door. I went around to his room, banged on his window, because surely he just fell back asleep. When I finally got into the house, I still looked everywhere for my son, and then I found him. I found my 10-year-old son hanging in the closet in this very room that I sit in today. I administered the CPR on him, and I knew immediately that my son was dead. I spent 8 years in the United States Navy as a corpsman, as a physician's assistant. I knew what death looked like. And to see it on the face of my 10-year-old son was a place and is a place that I will do everything from that moment to now to everything that I can do for any other parent not to experience that. Surely my son's not the first and he's not the last, but he has got me and people like Betsy in the fight to make sure that we have the tools and the equipment for prevention and now for us, awareness.
And I am so glad that you two are in the fight, and so many other mothers. To be able to sit in the same room, to sit in his room surrounded by his beautiful face. You've had a beautiful child, a handsome young man. It takes an amazing strength and courage How did you get to that place? Just in case there's a mother who's not there yet. How do you build resiliency? How do you build strength from such a tragic loss?
A great question, Dr. Loss. What I will say, and this is what I've said from the beginning, and it's something that I will champion always. No one plans to be a bereaved parent. And what I say is that get a relationship with God now, before life happens to you, before there is something that will send you reeling out of your way. Our faith was what started from when I saw him and I said, God, why my son? And I heard God say, I gave my son. I immediately knew that this was all God's plan. This was his time. 7 came here to do something. And here we are, 19 months today away. And so many lives that he saved because my husband and I stood on our faith, stood on the fact that, like Job, our children, our child and Job's children were not lost. We know where our son is.
Yeah.
I miss him. I miss him physically. But I will tell anybody, get a hold of your faith first. And the mission stays the same. It's all about the kingdom building. It's all I've done from the time that I've known the Lord, through all of our tragedies in life. My only mission is kingdom building. And the only thing I fear is to live this life and not be everything that God has called me to be.
Thank you for your remarkable and inspiring testimony and story, and encouragement. And I think that's going to inspire a lot of other families and mothers. Our
Shell?
faith is one. I want to ask Betsy. Yes, Betsy, I was going to say, in addition to faith, what other tools and skills and things can parents use to help get through and help them cope with with the loss of a child by suicide?
Let me first say that not even those with faith, because I had an incredibly strong faith. I had been a youth pastor for 10 years. My mother said I was always the kid who just naturally prayed. I'd always had a strong faith. Everybody reacts differently to this sort of loss and grief. And I'm so glad that Tammy had that gift. I had quite the opposite reaction. Because my son was a man of faith, and he had had a back injury at 17 and had been in excruciating pain for 6 years of his life. And that was I guess, the largest part of that puzzle. That was the largest. We know that when someone has a chronic health and that involves chronic pain, such as even a chronic health condition like heart disease, that puts them at risk for suicide. And so having that pain put him at risk for suicide, I didn't realize that. It's not something doctors talk about. And he always prayed and relied on prayer. Unfortunately, the downside, he would not also accept treatment because he felt that was a spiritual weakness. And so when he had depression, he wouldn't accept treatment for that because, again, he said, I'll turn to God and I'll pray. And I uplifted him in that because I was a person of faith. So naturally, for me, I had the opposite reaction. When Luke died, I was angry at God.
Yeah.
Because why? I knew Luke had made that choice at the last moment, which I've learned since is not quite the case because they're in a crisis, mental health crisis. They're in an irrational state and they can't think clearly. However, I was angry that God didn't reach down and take that pain away for just a moment to get him over the hump of that crisis. And it took me a long time. And can I say that my faith is where it was before Luke died? Not 100%. Fortunately, I do believe God is bigger than me, and and I know that God was even with me and allowed me to question Him and to fight and to be angry. And He always would send me small signs, and still does to this day, to let me know, hey, it may not be what it was, but we always will have a relationship, and I'm still lifting you up. So, what I would say is, we know from research, and it shows that if you have a faith, a strong faith, that can be a protective factor for those struggling,
Right.
for both lost survivors and those struggling with mental health disorders. It can be a protective factor, but you have to weave in other protective factors. And you're talking about resiliency. I would say for many, it's different. Every grief is different. People grieve differently. Suicide is designated as a complicated grief. And so we encourage treatment. We know that those who lose a loved one to suicide, especially if it's in the immediate family, have a risk factor for suicide themselves. And that's based on research. And so, and this is why people often say, oh, suicide runs in families. After Luke's death, I discovered that we had several suicides in our family that had been hidden and not disclosed as suicides. And so, it was a family skeleton. And the reason is because families have cultures. There's not been a gene identified as the suicide gene, but families have culture. And in cultures, we perpetrate stigma. And so if it's not thought that mental illness or a grief even, which is not a form of mental illness, but it's a particular life experience where you will need counseling, if you don't get the proper healing after such a loss, that can lead to suicide. That can make you at risk, more at risk.
That's right.
We also know that that feeling supported for both those with lived experience who are struggling and for those lost survivors, to feel supported by their community is important. There was an old saying among suicide groups that you don't get casseroles for suicide. And I think that's changing. I do see more support. I personally had both double-edged support. My church family, which was a Catholic church, was incredibly supportive and wonderful for us and continued. My United Methodist family from when I was a United Methodist youth pastor, I married a Catholic and became a Catholic through RCIA. But they were incredibly supportive. The day that Luke died, my children went out to play, and there were children of another more fundamentalist faith who told them Luke was burning in hell because of suicide.
And we need to help. We need to be able to better help children. And it goes back to the whole bullying piece too. There's some education that we need to better help prepare children as well. So it's not just how do we prepare adults. We have a question, and I want to make this a conversation and people to be able to access and utilize your experiences during this discussion. So can we toss it to Deb for the question, and then Betsy will come back to you and Tammy to explore deeper into the risk factors, the protective factors, and some other resources that's available. Deb?
Thank you, Dr. Laws. And thank you also to Betsy and to Tammy for just sharing your stories, sharing your hearts, for your courage, and for enduring, and for really responding to your call to help others. We're just so grateful. What a powerful conversation. I'd like to toss it to a question that's come in. I want to know, what is the role of trauma as a cause of suicide attempts rather than, say, a broken brain?
Trauma is a risk factor. Trauma is defined as anything that makes a person feel that their life is threatened, and there may be some post-traumatic stress related to that. And so in children, this can be the obvious traumas that we think about, or child abuse or negligence or something. But as in Seven's case, he had a life-threatening illness. And even though that may have been an underlying risk factor that, you know, it's there so deep in their conscious, in a child's conscious, they're not able to verbalize that. For Luke, his trauma was when he was 6 years old, he lost his father. And his father had Lou Gehrig's disease. My first husband. And Lou Gehrig's disease, he lived in his formative years identifying with a father, because children identify with their same-sex parent. He lived with a father who he saw in a wheelchair. And so when he had a back injury, we found in his diaries later where he said, well, they say it's not Lou Gehrig's disease, but who knows? I'll probably be dead by the time I'm 30, the way my dad was. That was an unresolved trauma that I didn't know needed resolving. So it is a risk factor for people.
Yeah, and I want to add that, that's why it's so extremely important for practitioners to receive education and training in trauma-informed care. Because there are a whole lot of people who are dealing with trauma in its many forms that have suppressed or that are not receiving appropriate treatment and care for. And that increases, right, the risk for suicidal ideation. And it depends on, who you are and how you respond and cope with the particular traumas. But I agree that it's not so much a broken brain, as people say, but, just as we would think of a heart disease as a physical illness, it's an illness that emerges and manifests. But I want to go back to this notion of culture. There are many families that suffer in silence, that grieve in silence. They grieve in silence because of the stigma as well as because of the shame. You mentioned, Tammy, your faith as being important, and we do know in the African American community, faith plays an extraordinarily important role in helping people to cope with all kinds of life issues, right? So I want to ask you, how can we better prepare the faith community to respond to a mother who is grieving? What are some things that the loss of a child by suicide, what are some things that they should not do, and what are some things that you encourage that they do to be helpful, if faith is the refuge?
Great question, Dr. Laws. And what I've found is I have been changed by my own grief. Some of the things that you hear, and maybe you've said before, and they're pretty cliche after a death, are things that you should not say to people. You hear me? In the faith part of it is, I went to Catholic school. You talk about the Catholicism. So I went to a Catholic school, and purgatory is a real thing. I went to Catholic school 12 years. For 11 months a year, I was in that place. So with that, it was deeply ingrained in us about suicide and about the stigma that follows. Now, for us in our community, and I will particularly say the Black community, we lean on our church for our faith and to get us through things. But let's not, let's have no qualms about how we self-medicate. So there is, as Betsy brought up, where there's a church on one corner and a liquor store on the other. We are able to mask, to cope through both sides and almost equally. Some of them could be, of course, extremes at either cost. However, our faith community doesn't understand, because immediately I was a suspect of murdering my 10-year-old son.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. I want to bring into this wonderful discussion that we're having another mother's story, and then we'll pick back up from there. the suspicion, living under the suspicion, living with the guilt. What did I do? What didn't I do? The suspicion that comes with certain parents, right? So I think that was a very important point that you brought up. But now we want to, I'll toss it back to Deborah, and we want to introduce another mother who I have the pleasure of working with at the Department of Health and Human Services. And we will listen to her story and bring that into the discussion as well.
Another very good story. Here it is. Take a listen.
I lost my 26-year-old daughter to suicide 3 years ago. And this is really Chantel's story. I'm originally from Germany, and a long time ago, I adopted 2 children when we were stationed in California, where my ex-husband was in the Air Force. So we first adopted my son, and then we adopted Chantel on our next tour to California. When we met Chantel, she was 18 months old. She had been through 3 foster homes, and she was a crack cocaine baby. So there were no real good predictions at the time as to what that would mean, but we just fell in love with her. My son wanted a baby sister, and the first time we met her, she kind of toddled into the room, walked straight over to Philip, sat in his lap, and he said, "When are we taking her home?" That was on a Friday. We brought her home on a Monday. Interesting factor is that my son is Caucasian, my daughter is African American, so we had to be pre-approved for a biracial or interracial adoption. So adopted both kids, and initially Chantel was behind because she had been through all these foster homes. She had never really bonded to anybody, but she started catching on a little bit. And then meanwhile, we moved to Ohio, and we're stationed there, and Chantel started preschool. And it became pretty obvious, I was a kindergarten teacher in a former life, that there were some things off. Her temper would just switch from good to horrible within seconds, and there was no telling what would set her off. So I think I had a pretty early inkling that some things just weren't right. She went to preschool there, finally went to elementary school, and early on diagnosed her with ADD, and she was only 8 when she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. So we started medicating, which is not something I prefer to do, but we started medicating pretty early on to help her manage bipolar disorder, which especially in children cycles rapidly. I think a complicating factor for Chantel's life was Dayton, Ohio is a fairly segregated city, and she was the only Black child in 6 first-grade classes. Her disability was Black, not bipolar, because they couldn't see the bipolar. So it wasn't only educating the school continually on her actual disability and how to best manage her, but it's fighting the racial stigma, because if she behaved poorly, it was, oh, the little Black kid isn't behaving, not she has a mental disability that keeps her from coping and managing her illness. And unfortunately, it pretty soon spiraled out of control. We subsequently moved to Washington, D.C. She had a slew of specialists. I learned to fight the school system early on for every accommodation she needed so she could succeed. And my message to Chantel, she could be the most fun person and she could light up a room with her smile, but she could also turn totally dark within seconds. So controlling those moods and learning how to manage that really became critical for me. And I have to give a lot of credit to my son, who was 5 years older than she, or is 5 years older. He always managed to work with her. It was really incredible. He has a real knack for that. But, hitting puberty, and at the same time I went through a divorce, I think totally pulled the rug out from under Chantel. So we went through the self-harming behavior, the cutting, the head banging, the psychiatrists. And I learned pretty rapidly coming from Germany that the American mental health care system consists of you're either in jail or you're on the street. Because I kept dealing with family services, and the answer I got was, well, if she has an outburst or she gets violent, you need to call the police. And I said, okay, so what will they do? Well, they'll take her on a psych hold for 72 hours. Well, what happens then? Well, she'll come back home. I said, that's not a treatment plan. This is an in and out of psych hold plan. So it got to the point where clearly I wasn't going to get the assistance I needed. And I found an organization, Parent Help Inc., because Chantel was eligible for adoption subsidy. And I was able to get her in a treatment home in Utah, out of all places. There was nothing in Virginia because adoption subsidy would only pay for nonprofit. And so I was able to locate the place in Utah. And I spent the next 3 years going to Utah every 6 weeks to see her because I didn't want her to be abandoned. Spend a weekend with her, fly back home, go back to work, you know, and manage my career, my other child, and Chantel's illness. As she aged out of Utah at 18, I sued essentially the school district to take her and provide accommodations for her. And they had a school inside a facility where she was then located. So that brought on the first stint in jail. She attacked a staff member because while she was little, she could have extremely violent outbursts. And so the answer to that was we sent her to jail. She came back to another facility and then started the facility after facility, the second stint in jail. And I remember going to court with her, and you know, she couldn't control her illness in spite of all the medications. But I remember going to court and listening to the judge say, well, she's not competent to stay on trial right now, but we'll make her competent. And I said, what does that mean? He said, well, we'll teach her about the Constitution and her rights. And I said, 80% of the population in this country doesn't know this. She is not only borderline mentally retarded of a lower IQ, she's bipolar, she'd been diagnosed with, she was schizophrenic. You are not making her competent, and being in jail isn't helpful. So she ended up in a really good group home in Virginia. I was very pleased. And I spent essentially every other weekend with Chantel because she was close to me. And it was often the struggle of, why do I have to take medication and other people don't? And, you know, I tried to tell her people have diabetes and take medication. It's okay to take medication if that's what you need to function. And she was highly functioning, but what most people could never understand with her mental illness, she could imitate life. She could say the right things, but nothing was ever internalized. So there is this part where you could never reach her. And so I think in 2016, I probably thought I would hit the lowest point. I got a Friday night call from the group home where she was saying, you immediately have to call the ICU in Richmond, the Virginia Commonwealth University Hospital. So I called down there and was informed my daughter had overdosed on 40 Tylenol, and I needed to come down there. She was her own guardian, but they didn't think she was capable of making decisions for herself. So rushed down to Richmond from Alexandria. And I'm in the ICU and I'm talking to her. And the doctor said to me, we're going to need your permission to intubate her and essentially put her in a coma and see what we can do. And I said, but she's okay. I'm talking to her. And he said, no, you don't understand. Her organs are shutting down. Her liver and kidneys are failing. And I said, so what are you going to do? And he said, well, she can't have a transplant. She's a suicide risk. Although I took this as a warning and not as a suicide attempt, which was probably crazy on my part. But as a parent, you keep hoping. I remember sitting there. I sat at that ICU for 14 days, praying her through this. And my son, who was in the military, we brought him back because the liver specialist said, you better bring him home. And he told me, he said, Mom, let me spend some time with Chantel. Go take a walk. And the next day she opened her eyes. It was like, oh my God, we made it. And before Christmas, she was out of the hospital. It was like, oh my God, this is so great. She was very concerned about her health. I mean, she was in another group home. I talked to her daily because she couldn't live in my house. And it took me a long time to understand, but somebody finally said, we have a 24/7 staff. You cannot watch her 24/7 and keep her safe. And that was a rough realization because there are quite a few people who judge you and say, oh, you made your life easy because you locked her up. No, I put her somewhere where somebody could provide 24/7 help for her that I could not necessarily do. Because while she lived in my home, I don't think I ever slept. It was in March, we were painting in our house in Alexandria, and it's like 9:30 in the morning on a Sunday, the doorbell rings. And I opened the door and it's Fairfax County Police. Well, Chantel wasn't in Fairfax County, so, no alarm bells went off. And the officer said, so are you Miss Cooper? And I said, yeah, well, you want to come in? And he said, well, I have news from Martin County. And I remember my reaction was just, no, I can't do this. And he said, we don't know what, and I felt bad for him. He was sent to bring a horrible message. He said, I don't know what your relationship is, but Miss Cooper is deceased. She committed suicide. It's something I don't wish on any parent ever. I had struggled to make Chantel better and help her for the 26 years I had the privilege of raising her. And then at the end, I couldn't save her. And it just about killed me. I will tell you that I think for the first year, I woke up every day thinking, I can't breathe. This simply can't happen. I never thought I would get over this because there's so much of Chantel that was part of our lives. And she could be so funny because she would always get in trouble. And she said to me one day, you know what? Because my son had been getting in trouble as a teenager. So she said, you know what? He keeps us up. I'll be the favorite here. I mean, she could be hilarious. And there's so many Chantel sayings we want to remember. Because I was struck with, is this all that's left of her? And I think that was probably the hardest realization, was 26 years of her life, and this is it. After about the first 6 to 8 months, it was really hard. I tried joining Grieving, these grievance groups, but there isn't even a word for a mother who has lost a child. It's when people ask me, how many children do you have? I don't know how to answer that. Do I say 2? Well, I had 2, but she's no longer with us. So there is no easy way to answer those questions. And that makes it really, really difficult. I would have never had the depth of understanding of mental health issues if I had not raised Chantel. It makes me a better person, and I think a better person in contracting because I want to help our folks who need the help the most. I think it also taught me a lot about racial insensitivity and prejudice in America. Raising a Black child and a white child, I was told, looking for houses in Ohio, I couldn't afford to buy there. And I'm thinking, why would that be? And then it occurred to me and it dawned on me and it raised an awareness I would have never had. I think there is so much Chantel taught me, and maybe that was her mission. It's been 3 years. This is a year my son and I have decided Chantel's happiest place on earth was the Outer Banks of North Carolina. I used to take my kids there all the time when they were little. And so my son and I have decided that this is the year we will take Chantel's ashes out to sea because that's where she was happy. And I think that's the place where she needs to be. I wasn't ready to let go until now, but I think I'm okay now with doing that. And I think I'm okay talking about it. But it is hard. It's a struggle. It's a club I don't care to belong to. But I also want to say what I have seen here at Health and Human Services. I've been to every single facility we operate. If my daughter were alive today, I'd fight to have her here. So that's Chantel's story. Still lots of things that I'll always remember. I wear her, this is her thumbprint that's been with me ever since. And when I have a bad day, I have a bad day. And I would say to anybody who is wrestling with this, you're going to have bad days. As I'm unpacking, we just moved, I find pictures Chantel drew for me or other things. And it's okay to have a bad day. It really is.
Wow, we are just so grateful for all of the stories that are being shared this afternoon. I imagine our audience is connecting on so many different levels. We have a question that's come in, and I want to direct this one to you, Tammy. The question is, what kinds of initiatives exist to properly train teachers on mental health, bullying, and recognizing their own prejudices?
Good question. Before 7, if you would have asked any one of his teachers, they would have denied wholeheartedly that they had no prejudices and they had no qualms, and they made no differences. And sometimes we don't even know that we have these bars and we have these doors up, and it's from us culturally, it's from our environment where we were raised, and then you put these teachers and their experiences in classrooms with a very diverse group. And what I believe that we can do, and I say can do because before January 19th, you can't tell me that we had done anything prior to this. What we can do is make people more aware of themselves. We all have shortcomings and insecurities and things that we are not great about in our lives. We should extend that to the children. We should extend that to each other. We should start from our principals down. And I often text or call my son's principal up to today. And I know, and I tell her, even across our country, but definitely across our state, there's not a day that goes by that Seven Bridges' name does not come up, because it pointed out so many insufficiencies in the school system, in the teachers themselves, in the administration. It is unfortunate that something so tragic has to happen in order for us to fix it, but we are fixing it. And if my son had to be the catalyst to point out the problem and for us to correct it, grateful. We must start with the mirror, Deborah. We must start with the mirror. We remember being some little kid. I mean, I talk too much. My nose is too big. My eyes are brown. My hair's too long. We all had something. And if we can understand not necessarily their equal insufficiencies or insecurities, but the similarity of the feeling. And if we can extend what we needed to the children, the students, from that feeling, it goes on to expound on what you're supposed to do as a teacher. Educate, help them build socially, their mental development, the way they interact with each other. These are the things that we can do to really break it down to the most common denominator of the one thing that my son absolutely was: compassionate, caring, and kind.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I do want to go, I'm going to come to you, Betsy, now. I want to, because we are getting ready to wrap up this discussion, and I hope that we don't stop having this conversation, because that's important. So, Betsy, you have mentioned, and we know it's important for us to leave our viewers with the warning signs, recognizing that there's not a one size fits all, and that signs may manifest differently in other people, in different people. So, share with us the warning signs that AFPS would like for the viewers to look out for, and also any resources or where they can find resources via AFPS.
AFSP. It's okay.
AFSP, I'm sorry. AFSP.
Let me just say AFSP.
Thank you.
American Foundation Suicide Prevention, AFSP.org. Go there, AFSP.org, and you can find the risk factors. If you just type in the search risk factors, you can find the warning signs. Again, please, if we can say anything, it's about public education. Tammy has given us our call to action. She has given us our call to action. I'm going to give you the mechanism, which is take an education course. If you are the parent of a child of any age, because these things can start early, take an education course. And we offer ours free and virtual online. Visit afsp.org and find out more, how you can learn more.
Thank you so much, Betsy. And I also want to encourage our viewers to, seek resources locally as well. We know there are many other organizations, NAMI, Mental Health America. There are many, but the key is to get educated and find resources that work for you. I also want for North Carolina to remind everyone that the Department of Health and Human Services stood up an amazing helpline during this particular time that we're in our state with the COVID pandemic, but it's a mental health hope line, and it's Hope for NC helpline, and the number is 1-855-587-3463, 855-587-3463, and that's Hope for NC. And then, of course, there's always the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, 1-800-273-8255, 1-800-273-8255. And in my final remarks, before I pass it to you, Tammy, and then back to Deborah, I just want to say that, when celebrities die by suicide, everybody's talking about the celebrities. Everybody is sending condolences and tweeting and using social media to express their concern and their care. Let's share that same support locally in the families, among the families that live right here in our communities. There are so many families that are living with the weight of the stigma as well as the shame from suicide, and just simply want a space to be able to talk about the loss of their loved one and to talk about some of the circumstances that may have led up to it. So let's do our part to help bring that discussion about suicide out from the shadows right into the light of day. Tammy, are there any other words that you'd like to say before we pass it back to Deborah, our host, to close us out?
For starters, I am so excited that we had this discussion. I am so excited that Betsy and I came from two ends of a candle. We were burning the candle at the two different ends, and it was very necessary. I am excited that we are doing this, and people have done it before. Betsy's been doing it for a long time. However, it is the call to action that we have that doesn't let us stop. Mm-hmm. We have to connect with each other. I am an 8-year United States Navy wartime veteran. I've seen several suicides. But what I know is our interaction with each other has saved more lives than the suicides that we can report. And for that, forever grateful.
Betsy, thank you. Tammy, thank you. Tossing it back to you, Deborah, to turn us out and to close us out. And thank you again so much for being our host for this important discussion today.
Absolutely. What an incredibly rich conversation. I've learned so much. Thank you, Dr. Laws, Betsy, Tammy, and Iris for sharing in this conversation on mothers who've lost a child to suicide. I'm Deborah Holt Noel.